What would you do if the man who vowed forever left you to die while holding another woman's hand? Stay with me. Trust me, this story will touch your soul. Like, share, and subscribe. The church bells rang with a sound that could split hearts in half. It was supposed to be a melody of joy, but to anyone who knew the truth, it was a cruel betrayal wrapped in gold and silk. Inside the grand cathedral of St. Raphael's, the air was thick with the perfume of roses, lilies, and the scent of wealth. Rows of glittering chandeliers poured warm light down upon an audience of the city's most powerful people. Cameras flashed like lightning, capturing every detail of the millionaire CEO's perfect wedding. Edward Langston stood at the altar, tall, handsome, dressed in a custom-tailored tuxedo. He carried himself with the smug pride of a man who believed the world belonged to him. His hand was linked with that of Vanessa Cruz, a glamorous woman 10 years younger, a socialite with a smile that screamed victory. Today, she wasn't just becoming his bride, she was stepping into a throne of power, wealth, and status. The guests whispered their envy. "She caught the richest man in the city," one woman murmured. "And his poor wife? Well, I heard she's gone for good." But across town, in the stark, sterile halls of St. Mary's Hospital, the truth was unfolding in silence and pain. Laya Langston, Edward's legal wife, was fighting for her life. Her fragile body trembled on the delivery bed as sweat poured down her pale face. She was only 26, her belly swollen beyond belief, carrying not one, not two, but 3 babies, triplets. Her lips whispered prayers between screams, clinging to hope that someone, anyone, might stand by her side. But the chair next to her bed was empty. The man who had vowed to love her in sickness and health, for richer or poorer, was miles away, smiling for photographers as he slipped a ring on another woman's finger. The nurses rushed around her, voices urgent. "She's losing too much blood. We need the doctor now." Lila's vision blurred, but in her fading strength, she thought of her unborn children. She remembered how Edward once placed his hand on her stomach, promising they would raise a family together. That memory now felt like poison. Her breaths grew shallow, and a single tear rolled down her cheek. Back at the cathedral, the priest's voice echoed. "Do you, Edward Langston, take Vanessa Cruz to be your lawful wedded wife?" Edward's lips curled into a proud smile. "I do." The applause thundered, champagne glasses clinked, and the organ played triumphantly. But no one in that grand room knew that his real wife, the mother of his children, was gasping for air in a hospital bed. The irony was unbearable. Lila was not only fighting for her own life, but for the survival of the 3 tiny souls within her. With every contraction, pain ripped through her body like fire. She squeezed the bedsheet, her knuckles white, whispering names she had already chosen for her babies. "Stay with me," she begged in a broken voice. "Please, my little ones, stay with me." The doctor finally rushed in, his expression grim. "She's critical. If we don't act now, we'll lose her and the babies." At the very same moment, Edward and Vanessa kissed in front of hundreds of flashing cameras. His hand held hers high, like a trophy, while journalists captured the image that would soon make headlines. Millionaire CEO marries stunning socialite in wedding of the year. But headlines can never tell the whole story. As the wedding party moved toward the ballroom for the extravagant reception, caviar, champagne fountains, and a 10-tier cake, Lila's heartbeat on the hospital monitor faltered. The beeping grew irregular, every second louder than the cheers echoing in the cathedral. Her mind drifted to the night Edward abandoned her. She had begged him not to leave, begged him to remember the vows they once shared. He had laughed coldly, saying, "You're nothing but a burden now. Vanessa is the future. You're the past." Those words sliced her soul open, and now, on the brink of death, they replayed in her ears like a cruel anthem. "Doctor, we're losing her," a nurse cried. The machines screamed their warning. The doctor barked orders. Nurses rushed with surgical tools, and the room descended into chaos. Lila's world slipped into darkness. At the reception hall, Edward raised his champagne glass, his eyes glinting with arrogance. "To new beginnings," he declared. The crowd erupted with cheers. But destiny has a way of writing its own vows, stronger than any man's betrayal. Just as the first toast ended, a hospital intern, trembling with urgency, pushed open the cathedral doors. His clothes were wrinkled, his breath short, but his voice carried across the hall. "Mr. Langston," he shouted, "it's your wife. She's dying in labor." The room fell into stunned silence. Vanessa's smile froze. Edward's glass slipped from his hand, shattering against the marble floor. Gasps rippled through the crowd as whispers turned into a storm. And in that single moment, the fairy tale wedding cracked open, revealing the ugly truth Edward had tried to bury. Long before she was gasping for life in a hospital bed, Lila Martinez had been just another ordinary girl with extraordinary dreams. She grew up in a small town on the outskirts of Houston, raised by a single mother who worked double shifts at a diner. Their apartment was tiny, the wallpaper peeling, the fridge often empty. But what the house lacked in wealth, it overflowed with love. Her mother, Elena, was the anchor of her world. She taught Lila that dignity wasn't about riches, but about the way one carried herself in moments of hardship. Every evening, even after 12-hour shifts, Elena would braid Lila's hair, kiss her forehead and whisper, "You are worth more than gold, my little star. One day, the world will know your light." Lila carried those words with her, even as life tested her resolve. She excelled in school, not because the path was easy, but because she refused to surrender. She dreamed of becoming a teacher, of shaping young minds the way her mother had shaped hers. But when her mother passed away suddenly from a heart attack, those dreams seemed to collapse into dust. At only 19, Lila was alone in the world, clinging to survival more than ambition. It was during one of her lowest moments that she met Edward Langston. He wasn't the millionaire CEO he would later become. Back then, he was a rising businessman, still carving his empire. Lila was working as a waitress, exhausted and invisible to most of the customers, but not to him. Edward saw her struggling with a tray of drinks, rushing between tables with sweat dampening her forehead. He flashed that charming smile that could melt anyone's defenses and left her a tip big enough to cover her week's rent. Their eyes met. For the first time since her mother's death, Lila felt noticed. Edward courted her with a persistence that overwhelmed her defenses. Flowers arrived at the diner. Expensive dresses appeared at her apartment door. He spoke of a future filled with love, security, and dreams she never dared to imagine. To a girl who had lost everything, Edward seemed like salvation. Within a year, she was his wife. For a while, life truly did feel like a fairy tale. They lived in a sprawling penthouse overlooking the city skyline. He took her to charity galas, dressed her in gowns that shimmered under chandeliers, and whispered promises of forever in her ear. She believed every word. But fairy tales, as Lila would learn, often come with hidden monsters. As Edward's empire grew, so did the distance between them. Board meetings replaced date nights. Business trips replaced family dinners. Lila, now in her early 20s, found herself spending long nights alone in a mansion that felt more like a prison. When she told Edward she wanted to continue her studies and become a teacher, his response chilled her. "Why would you need to work?" he scoffed. "Your job is to look perfect, host dinners, and give me heirs. Leave the real achievements to me." Her heart sank, but she swallowed her pain. She reminded herself of her mother's words. Dignity was how you carried yourself in hardship. And so she smiled, nodded, and pretended the emptiness didn't hurt. The only light in her loneliness came when she discovered she was pregnant. She thought it would be the miracle that bound them again. Edward seemed thrilled at first. He touched her belly, spoke of building nurseries, and promised he would slow down to be there. For a brief time, Lila felt like they were a family again. But then came the news. Not one baby, not two, but 3. Triplets. The doctors warned her it would be a dangerous pregnancy. Lila's body was small and fragile. Carrying 3 children was a risk that could cost her life. But she refused to give up. She wanted these babies with every beat of her heart. She wanted to give them the love she had lost when her mother died. Edward's reaction was colder. At first, he pretended to be supportive, but she saw the worry in his eyes. Not worry for her, but for his reputation, his schedule, his perfect life. As her belly grew, so did his impatience. He stopped accompanying her to doctor's visits. He started staying out late. The scent of unfamiliar perfume clung to his suits. The whispers reached her soon after. Edward was seen dining with Vanessa Cruz, a socialite known for climbing her way into the arms of wealthy men. At first, Lila didn't believe it. She told herself her husband loved her, that the man who once left roses at her door couldn't possibly betray her now. But the truth became undeniable. One evening, Lila walked into Edward's study, only to find a velvet jewelry box left carelessly on his desk. Inside was an engagement ring, not hers, not something she had ever seen before. Her hands shook as she realized what it meant. When she confronted him, his mask of charm dropped. He sneered. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Lila. Vanessa is my future. You're nothing but a tired little girl with too many babies." Her world shattered. She wanted to scream, to remind him of their vows, of the nights he had sworn she was his only love, but the words froze in her throat. She was 6 months pregnant with triplets, her body swollen and weak. She had no family to turn to, no one who would stand on her side. She was trapped. From that night, Edward's cruelty sharpened. He stopped hiding Vanessa. He paraded her at public events, allowed the tabloids to speculate, and left Lila humiliated in the shadows. But still, Lila endured. She endured for the 3 tiny heartbeats inside her. And now, in that hospital room, her endurance was being tested to its breaking point. Each contraction felt like her body was splitting in half. She clung to the memory of her mother's voice, whispering, "You are worth more than gold." The machines beeped louder. The doctor's voice grew urgent. "We're losing her." Somewhere in the fog of her pain, Lila heard a nurse's voice. "Should we call her husband?" The doctor's reply was like ice. "Forget the husband. He's at his wedding with another woman." And with those words, the last fragile thread of hope inside Lila snapped as the room plunged into chaos. The city that night was split in 2 worlds. One glittered beneath chandeliers and champagne fountains. The other reeked of antiseptic and echoed with the beeping of machines. Between those 2 worlds lay the heart of betrayal, beating like a drum no one could ignore. At the Langston wedding, wealth dripped from every corner. The ballroom of the St. Raphael Grand Hotel had been transformed into a palace. Velvet curtains cascaded from ceilings 3 stories high. Golden chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls, scattering light onto tables dressed in white silk. Waiters in crisp uniforms balanced trays of caviar and Dom Perignon, weaving between the city's elite. The air buzzed with gossip, envy, and laughter, too loud to be genuine. Vanessa Cruz was the star of the evening. She glowed in her custom Verawang gown, every stitch tailored to perfection. Diamonds the size of raindrops glittered on her neck. As she floated across the floor on Edward's arm, guests whispered in admiration. "She's breathtaking," someone sighed. Another chuckled. She knew exactly what she was doing. Poor first wife never stood a chance. No one dared speak Lila's name. It was as if she had already been erased from the story. Meanwhile, just 6 miles away, the hospital walls rattled with a different music. The shrill alarm of monitors, the frantic shuffle of nurses, and the low groans of a woman losing her battle against pain. Lila's room was dimly lit, the fluorescent lights flickering as if mocking her struggle. Sweat soaked her gown, her hair clung to her temples, and her breaths came in ragged gasps. The smell of disinfectant mixed with the metallic tang of blood in the air. Every contraction tore her apart. A nurse wiped her forehead gently. "Stay with us, honey. Stay with us for your babies." Lila wanted to answer, but her voice cracked into a whisper. "Edward, where is he?" The nurse's silence was louder than words. Back at the wedding, Edward Langston held court like a king among pawns. His tuxedo was flawless, his smile calculated. Reporters snapped photos, their flashes lighting his arrogance. Every article would crown him the city's most powerful bachelor turned groom of the year. He basked in it, each compliment feeding his ego. At the head table, Vanessa leaned close, her perfumes sweet and intoxicating. "You finally buried your past," she purred. "From this day, it's just you and me." Edward raised his glass. "To the future," he declared. Crystal glasses clinked, laughter rose like thunder, and the orchestra swelled with music. But destiny has a way of mocking even the proudest men. Because across town, Lila's doctor barked an order. "We're prepping for an emergency C-section. She's hemorrhaging." The words pierced the sterile air like knives. Nurses scrambled, wheeling in equipment. The monitor beside her beeped erratically, the line of her life zigzagging closer to disaster. Lila clutched a nurse's hand, her eyes wide with terror. "Please," she gasped, "don't let my babies die." Her voice was raw, broken, but filled with the strength of a mother's love. As she was rushed toward the operating room, her mind drifted. She remembered her first dance with Edward at their wedding years ago. when his eyes had glistened with promises of forever. She had believed him then, believed that love could heal all wounds. Now, he was spinning another woman around a ballroom while she bled out on a hospital bed. The contrast was cruel, almost too much for the heavens to allow. At the hotel, the wedding cake towered like a monument to excess, 10 tiers of sugar and gold leaf, topped with figurines of a bride and groom who were nothing more than lies carved into sweetness. Guests lined up with their phones, recording every decadent detail. One guest whispered, "It's the wedding of the decade." Another muttered, "Strange though, isn't it? His first wife only disappeared a few months ago. Almost too convenient." But their murmurs were drowned in music, swallowed by the orchestra's triumphant notes. At the hospital there was no music, no applause, only the deafening silence of fear. The doctor's gloved hands worked quickly, cutting through layers with precision. Lila's body trembled under anesthesia, her lips moving silently in prayer. "Mama, help me," she whispered, as if calling to the mother she lost years ago. The first cry of a baby pierced the room, then a second, then a third. Tiny, fragile voices filled the sterile air, proof that miracles could be born even in the shadow of death. Nurses rushed to cradle the infants, wrapping them in warm blankets. "2 girls and a boy," one announced softly. "They're alive." But their mother's pulse was fading. Her blood pressures crashing, the doctor shouted. "We're losing her." The nurses scrambled, pushing fluids, trying to stop the bleeding. The babies wailed as if calling for the mother, slipping away from them. Back at the wedding, Edward lifted Vanessa in a dramatic spin on the dance floor, the crowd cheering. Flashbulbs froze the moment in golden light. His arrogance blinded him to the storm brewing beyond those marble walls. And then, just as he dipped Vanessa for a kiss, the cathedral doors burst open. A hospital intern stood there, disheveled, his scrubs stained, his breath ragged. His voice rang through the hall, slicing the music in two. "Mr. Langston, your wife, she's dying in labor." The ballroom fell into stunned silence. Vanessa's painted smile faltered. Edward's hand slipped, his face draining of color. Guests gasped, whispers rising like wildfire. The orchestra froze mid-note, the champagne glasses stilled in midair. And in that grand, glittering hall, Edward Langston realized that the 2 worlds he had tried to keep apart, one of gold and one of blood, were colliding. And as he turned toward the doors, he had no idea that what awaited him would destroy everything he thought he controlled. Edward Langston had always been a man who thrived on control. From the moment he clawed his way out of a modest upbringing, he vowed he would never again feel small, powerless, or ignored. He built his empire brick by brick, deal by deal, crushing competitors with a ruthless smile. People admired his brilliance, but they feared his ambition more. And for Edward, fear was more intoxicating than love. When he first met Lila, she had been soft, gentle, the kind of woman who believed in forever. At that stage of his life, Edward wanted stability, a quiet partner who would make him look respectable. Lila was perfect for that role. She adored him, obeyed him, and asked for nothing but his attention. But as the years passed, her devotion became a mirror he didn't want to face. She reminded him of promises he no longer intended to keep. To Edward, she was a burden, a relic of his early climb. Vanessa Cruz was the opposite. She was fire-wrapped in silk, ambition painted across red lips. Where Lila was modest, Vanessa was bold. Where Lila sacrificed, Vanessa demanded. She didn't beg for Edward's attention, she made him chase her, using every glance and laugh as bait. Their affair began at a charity gala. Lila had been pregnant with the triplets, quietly excusing herself from the crowd to rest. Edward remained, his eyes drawn to Vanessa across the room. She knew exactly what she was doing, leaning close to influential men, whispering in their ears with a laugh that lingered too long. When Edward introduced himself, she pretended indifference, the oldest trick in the book. "You're just another CEO," she said with a smirk. "Convince me why I should care." For the first time in years, Edward felt challenged. And Edward loved nothing more than conquest. Soon, Vanessa was everywhere. On his arm at business dinners, in his car late at night, in his penthouse when Lila was left alone. She became his confidant, his partner in schemes, the one who fed his ego with sweet poison. "You deserve more than a tired wife and screaming children," she told him one night, her fingers trailing his jawline. "You deserve me. Together, we'll own this city." It didn't take long for Edward to believe her. He stopped coming home. He stopped pretending. When tabloids whispered about the affair, Edward didn't silence them. He fed them. He wanted the world to see Vanessa as his, wanted Lila to feel erased. Vanessa reveled in the humiliation she orchestrated. One afternoon, she deliberately wore Edward's jacket, the one Lila had gifted him years ago, and flaunted it at a charity luncheon. The photographers caught every angle. The next morning, magazines splashed the photo across their covers with the headline, "The New Queen Beside the King." Lila saw the image in the hospital waiting room. Her heart cracked, but she said nothing. She had learned that her silence was Edward's expectation. Still, the pain carved deeper lines into her fragile body. Edward, meanwhile, crafted a narrative to justify his betrayal. "Lila isn't strong enough for my world," he told colleagues, dismissing her as if she were a failed investment. "She's fragile, unambitious. Vanessa understands me. She's my equal." The cruelty wasn't just in what he said, but in how he displayed it. At board meetings, he invited Vanessa to sit beside him in the chair Lila once occupied. At galas, he introduced her as the woman who makes my life worth living. Every gesture was calculated, every word a dagger aimed at Lila's heart. Vanessa played her role to perfection. She whispered in his ear during speeches, laughed at his jokes louder than anyone else, and touched his arm at every opportunity. She didn't just want his wealth, she wanted to wear his name like a crown. And she wanted Lila to watch from the shadows. Powerless, yet beneath her flawless makeup and rehearsed charm, Vanessa was terrified. She knew Edward's loyalty was fickle. He had traded one wife for her. What would stop him from trading her for someone younger, richer, or more useful? That fear made her dangerous. She clung to Edward not out of love, but out of desperation to secure her place before he could discard her too. The night of the wedding was supposed to be her victory. The ballroom sparkled, the cameras flashed, and she glided like royalty. She told herself she had won. But when the hospital intern burst through the doors with the news of Lila's labor, her triumph cracked. She saw the flicker of panic in Edward's eyes and hated it. "She's nothing," Vanessa hissed under her breath as whispers rippled through the guests. "Don't you dare run to her. This is our night." But Edward wasn't listening. His mind raced with the realization that the woman he had abandoned was carrying not just one child but 3, triplets, a legacy far greater than he had ever imagined. If Lila died, he would still inherit heirs. If she lived, she would forever tie him to her. Either way, Vanessa's victory wasn't as secure as she thought. Vanessa grabbed his arm, nails digging into his sleeve. "Stay here. If you walk out that door, they'll all see you for what you are." Weak. Edward's jaw tightened. Cameras were still flashing, guests still staring. His empire was built on appearances, and right now, appearances demanded that he look unshaken. So he forced a smile, raised his champagne glass, and said loudly, "Ignore the distraction. Tonight is about love." The orchestra resumed, the crowd hesitated, and Vanessa plastered her smile back on. But the damage was done. Behind those glittering eyes, Edward was calculating, and Vanessa knew it. Across town, in the operating room, Lila's heart faltered. Doctors fought to keep her alive, her babies crying in the nursery as if calling her back. At the wedding, Vanessa leaned close, her whisper dripping with venom. "She'll die, Edward. She'll die, and then you'll finally be free. Don't look so worried. Isn't this what you wanted?" But Edward's eyes betrayed him, because for the first time in his life, he realized the one woman he had discarded might be the only person capable of destroying him. The moment the hospital intern's voice echoed across the ballroom, the air in the St. Raphael Grand Hotel shifted. It was as if every chandelier had dimmed, every violin string had snapped. The words, "Your wife is dying in labor," hung in the air like poison. Edward froze. His champagne glass shattered at his feet. Vanessa clutched his arm, her nails biting into his sleeve, forcing her smile back into place for the cameras, but the whispers had already begun. "Wife? Did he just say wife?" A guest muttered, eyes wide. "Isn't Vanessa supposed to be his first?" Another gasped. "No. The first wife? She's still alive?" The ballroom became a hive of speculation, the hum of gossip louder than the orchestra. Reporters, hungry for scandal, raised their cameras higher, snapping pictures with renewed frenzy. For years, Edward had carefully crafted the image of a powerful, flawless man. But now the cracks were visible for all to see. On the other side of town, the hospital was chaos. Lila lay unconscious, her breathing shallow, her face pale as wax. The triplets, 2 tiny girls and 1 fragile boy, were in incubators, their cries muffled by glass walls. Nurses rushed around, voices clipped, hearts heavy. "She's bleeding out. We need more units of blood. Keep pressure. Don't let her slip." The contrast was cruel. In the hospital, life and death wrestled in silence. In the ballroom, wealth and vanity tried desperately to drown out the truth. Edward cleared his throat, trying to salvage control. "Ignore this interruption," he said, his voice tight but loud enough to carry. "My first wife is no longer part of my life. Tonight we celebrate love and—" But the crowd wasn't convinced. Murmurs grew louder, sharper. A woman at the front shook her head. "No longer part of your life? She's carrying your children? And you're here, marrying someone else?" Another voice rose from the back. "Is this true, Edward? Did you abandon your wife while she's giving birth?" The question stabbed deeper than any blade. Edward's smile faltered. For the first time in years, he looked cornered. Vanessa, sensing the shift, tightened her grip. She leaned close, whispering through clenched teeth. "Smile. Don't let them see you panic. This is our night." But her words only fueled the fire. Cameras flashed faster. Guests reached for their phones, already typing messages that would spread across social media before the cake was even cut. #CEO with mistress, wife dying alone, triplet scandal. The hashtags would trend before midnight. Meanwhile, at the hospital, a young nurse named Clara pressed a damp cloth to Lila's forehead, her eyes brimming with tears. "Hold on, sweetheart. Your babies need you. Don't leave them." Lila's lips moved faintly, forming words no one could hear. A prayer, a plea, maybe a goodbye. Clara squeezed her hand tighter. "Fight. Please fight." Back at the wedding, Edward raised his voice again. "My personal life is none of your concern. Tonight is about me and Vanessa. End of story." But the crowd wasn't satisfied. A man in a navy suit, an old investor with deep pockets, stood up. His voice boomed across the room. "End of story? Not for your shareholders, Edward. If this scandal hits the papers, your empire will crash. No man can run a company while the world calls him a cheat who left his pregnant wife to die." The words struck harder than a physical blow. Edward's empire wasn't just built on money. It was built on reputation. And reputation was crumbling before his eyes. Vanessa tried to laugh it off, raising her glass. "Everyone loves to gossip. Don't believe everything you hear." But her laughter rang hollow. Guests exchanged knowing glances. The seed of doubt had already sprouted. Outside the hotel, paparazzi swarmed like vultures, their lenses waiting for blood. They smelled scandal, the kind that could sell millions of copies. By morning, Edward's carefully built image would be shredded. And then came the cruelest twist. One of the hospital staff, desperate to reach Edward, called his office line. The assistant panicked, leaked the truth to a reporter friend. Within minutes, a breaking news banner flashed across the city's biggest news network. CEO Edward Langston marries mistress while wife fights for life, giving birth to triplets. The reception hall erupted as guests' phones buzzed with notifications. Screens lit up showing the headline, the photos, the scandal in black and white. Gasps turned to outrage. How could he? Triplets, and he's here? This is monstrous. Vanessa's face paled beneath her makeup. Edward grabbed her hand, forcing a smile for the cameras, but his eyes betrayed fury. He leaned down, whispering, "If this ruins me, it ruins you too." Vanessa's jaw tightened. She wasn't afraid of the whispers. She was afraid that Edward might decide she wasn't worth the cost. Meanwhile, in the hospital, doctors worked tirelessly. "We're losing her pulse," one shouted. Clara pressed Lila's hand to her chest, whispering, "Think of your babies. Don't give up. Don't let him win." In her unconscious haze, Lila's mind drifted to a vision. She saw her 3 children, tiny hands reaching for her. She saw her mother, smiling gently, whispering the same words she had heard as a child. "You are worth more than gold." Her heart monitor beeped weakly, each sound a fragile thread between life and death. Back at the hotel, Edward tried to take the microphone, but the noise was deafening. Guests shouted, reporters snapped photos, and the orchestra had long gone silent. His empire was slipping from his grasp. And then, from the back of the room, a voice rang out clear as a bell. A woman, her tone sharp with contempt. "You left your wife to die, Edward, and when she survives, because she will, you'll regret every choice you made." The crowd turned to see who had spoken. Gasps filled the room. Because standing in the doorway was someone no one expected. Someone who could destroy Edward's world with a single truth. The hospital room was a storm of chaos. Machines screamed with urgent alarms, their sharp beeps cutting through the sterile air. Nurses moved quickly, their voices tight with fear. "Blood pressure's dropping," one shouted. "We need more oxygen, now!" Lila's body was frail, trembling, her skin ghostly pale. Her lips moved faintly, whispering words no one could hear. Her chest rose and fell shallowly, as if every breath was borrowed from the edge of eternity. Dr. Patel, the lead physician, barked orders. "Clamp harder, suction. We cannot lose her. Those babies need their mother." The 3 infants, safe but fragile, lay in incubators nearby, their tiny cries piercing the tension. The sound of their wails sliced through the nurses' hearts. They knew what was at stake. They weren't just saving a woman, they were fighting for the bond that tied a mother to her children. Meanwhile, across town, the scandal at the wedding had spiraled out of control. Guests no longer danced, no longer laughed. Instead, they gossiped in hushed tones, phones buzzing with updates from the news. Edward tried to salvage his image, but every word sounded hollow. "She's dying in labor, Edward," one guest spat, glaring at him. "And you're here drinking champagne. What kind of man does that?" Edward's smile faltered. For the first time, fear crept into his expression. It wasn't fear for Lila, it was fear for himself. His empire was built on reputation, and reputation was bleeding out faster than Lila's fragile body. Vanessa, sensing the crowd's shift, tightened her grip on Edward's arm. "Ignore them," she whispered. "This is still our night. Let her go. She's weak. You don't need her." But the guests weren't letting go. Cameras flashed, recording every twitch of Edward's jaw, every tremble of Vanessa's smile. And in the background, the big screen that once displayed their engagement photos now glowed with breaking news headlines. CEO Edward Langston abandons pregnant wife, mistress at his side. Edward's chest tightened. He had spent years climbing to the top, and in one evening, it all threatened to collapse. Back in the hospital, Lila's heart monitor flatlined for a brief, horrifying moment. The shrill sound froze everyone in place. Clara, the young nurse who had been at her side since the beginning, screamed, "No, come back to us!" Dr. Patel shouted, "Charge the paddles. We're bringing her back." The defibrillator pads pressed against her chest. Clear. Electricity surged through Lila's frail body, jerking her upward before she fell back limp. The monitor blipped faintly, then flatlined again. Clara's tears streamed down her face. She bent close, whispering fiercely, "Lila, your babies need you. They need their mother. Don't let him win. Don't let him raise them without you." Her words, desperate and trembling, seemed to echo into whatever space Lila's soul hovered in. Inside the darkness of unconsciousness, Lila's mind drifted. She saw her mother again, Elena, standing in a meadow filled with sunlight, smiling gently. "It's not your time, my little star," Elena whispered. "You have 3 lights waiting for you. You must go back." A tear slipped from Layla's closed eye. The doctor saw it and screamed, "Charge again, higher voltage." Clear, her body jolted once more. This time, the monitor beeped weakly, then stronger, then steadier. A fragile rhythm returned, a heartbeat. "She's back," a nurse shouted. Relief rippled through the room, but it was fragile. Lila wasn't safe yet. She was alive, but barely. Back at the hotel, Edward excused himself under the guise of urgent business. He slipped into a side corridor, his phone pressed to his ear. "Tell me the truth," he snapped at his assistant. "Is she alive?" The voice on the other end hesitated. She coded for a moment, sir. But they brought her back. The babies are alive too." Edward's fist clenched. Relief flickered, but not for her sake. For his. 3 heirs, a powerful legacy. The Langston name would echo through generations. But that relief quickly turned to dread. If Lila survived, she held the key to destroy him. Vanessa followed, her heels clicking against the marble. "You're not seriously considering going to her," she hissed. "If you show weakness now, you'll lose everything." Edward's jaw tightened. "If she dies, I inherit everything clean. If she lives, she owns half of me." Vanessa's eyes darkened. She had always feared Lila's shadow. Even half dead, even erased from tabloids, the first wife still held a power Vanessa couldn't steal. "She'll never be strong enough to fight you," Vanessa said quickly. "She's nothing. Let the doctors finish what nature already started, then we'll be untouchable." But Edward didn't answer. For the first time, doubt gnawed at him. Meanwhile, in the hospital, Clara sat by Lila's bed after the chaos settled, holding her hand tightly. "You're stronger than he ever believed," she whispered. "One day, you'll show him, and the world will stand with you." The triplets slept soundly in their incubators, their tiny chests rising and falling. They were fragile, but alive. Their cries had quieted, replaced by soft breaths. They were the proof of Lila's strength, the living legacy of her love. But Lila herself was not out of danger. The doctor approached Clara quietly. "She's stable for now, but the next 24 hours will decide everything." Clara nodded, stroking Lila's hand. "Then we'll fight every second of those hours." Back at the hotel, the reception was unraveling. Guests began leaving, muttering in disgust. Reporters shouted questions. Edward refused to answer. Vanessa smiled tightly for the cameras, but her eyes were filled with fear. She knew the tide was turning, and Edward's grip on power was slipping. Edward stood alone for a moment, staring at his reflection in a gilded mirror. For the first time in years, he didn't see triumph. He saw a man on the verge of ruin. And then his phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. He opened it, his eyes narrowing. The words chilled him to the bone. "She's alive, and she knows." Edward's hands trembled. Who sent it? How? He looked around the ballroom, suddenly paranoid. Vanessa returned, placing her hand on his shoulder. "What is it?" Edward didn't answer. He slipped the phone back into his pocket, his heart pounding. Because if Lila was alive, and if she truly knew what he had done, then the real war hadn't even begun. The hospital had finally quieted after the storm. Lila lay still in her bed, the soft hum of machines keeping rhythm with her fragile breaths. The room was dim, but the glow of the incubators lit her with a faint halo. 3 tiny lives, her triplets, slept peacefully, their innocence untouched by betrayal. Clara, the devoted nurse, sat vigil at her side, unwilling to let her face the silence alone. In that silence, something inside Lila stirred. She was no longer just a wife abandoned, no longer just a weak girl clinging to hope. The brush with death had carved her raw, but it had also lit a fire. Her body was broken, but her spirit had begun to rise from the ashes. When her eyes opened, Clara leaned forward quickly. "Lila, you're awake," she whispered, her relief flooding the room. Lila's voice was raspy but firm. "My babies?" Clara pointed to the incubators. "They're alive. All 3, 2 girls and a boy. They're fighters, just like their mother." A tear slid down Lila's cheek, but it wasn't weakness. It was resolve. She turned her head, her voice steadier than Clara expected. "Then I can't leave them. I won't let Edward or anyone else steal their future." Clara blinked. She had seen mothers weep, beg, surrender. But in Lila's eyes she saw something different. Steel hidden beneath scars. "You're not alone in this," Clara said softly. "There are people who know what he's done, and they want to help you." Lila's brows furrowed. "Help me?" Clara hesitated, then reached into her pocket and pulled out a flash drive. "I shouldn't be doing this, but one of Edward's assistants came to me tonight. She couldn't stand watching him destroy you. She gave me this. It's proof. Emails, contracts, photos, everything that ties Edward to Vanessa, everything he tried to bury." Lila stared at the small piece of plastic, her heart racing. Evidence, the very thing Edward had always controlled with his money and threats, was now in her hand. For the first time, she felt the balance tilt. Meanwhile, at the Langston mansion, Edward paced furiously. Vanessa lounged on the velvet sofa, swirling wine in her glass, pretending calm. But her eyes betrayed her unease. "You look worried," she said smoothly. "Why? She's weak in a hospital bed. You're still here with me." Edward slammed his fist on the table. "She's alive, Vanessa. Alive. And someone sent me a message saying she knows." Vanessa froze, her glass trembling slightly. "Knows what?" Edward's glare was sharp. "Everything." Silence hung heavy between them. For years, Edward had believed himself untouchable. He had silenced competitors, buried scandals, bought loyalty. But if Lila had evidence, if she could expose him, it wouldn't just destroy his marriage. It would destroy his empire. Vanessa placed her glass down carefully. "Then we strike first. If she wants a war, we make sure she never leaves that hospital alive." Edward looked at her, shocked at her bluntness, but then slowly nodded. "If she thinks she can stand against me, she'll regret it." But what Edward didn't know was that Lila was no longer fighting alone. The next morning, as sunlight streamed through the hospital blinds, Lila sat up weakly, determination etched on her face. Clara entered with a man in a suit, mid-30s, sharp eyes, but kind. "Lila," Clara said, "this is Daniel Hayes. He's an investigative journalist. He's been following Edward's corruption for years, but he never had a way in, until now." Daniel stepped forward, his voice steady. "Mrs. Langston, I know this is overwhelming, but if you want justice, if you want to protect your children, I can help you. Edward thinks he's untouchable, but he's left a trail. All we need is your voice, your courage." Lila's hand trembled, but she gripped the flash drive tightly. "For my babies," she whispered. "For them, I'll fight." Daniel nodded. "Then we bring the truth to light." Back at the mansion, Vanessa tried to steady Edward's nerves. She stroked his arm, whispering venom disguised as comfort. "You built everything. No one can touch you. The world will believe your story over hers. She's a fragile woman, broken, barely alive. And you're the empire." But Edward wasn't convinced. That single message, "she knows," echoed in his head like a warning bell. His empire might not crumble from force, but from the truth. At the hospital, Lila gathered her strength. She was still weak, her body stitched and scarred, but her spirit felt different. No longer the girl who once believed Edward's lies. She was a mother with 3 lives depending on her. And for them, she would rise. Daniel laid out the plan. "We'll start slow. A press leak, a whisper here and there. The public already smells blood from the wedding scandal. When the time is right, we'll hit them with the full truth. But you need to be ready, Lila. Edward will fight back hard." Lila looked down at her babies, her eyes softening. "He can't hurt me anymore. Not the way he used to. If he wants war, I'll give him war." That night, Edward sat in his office, staring out at the city skyline, whiskey in hand. Vanessa approached from behind, wrapping her arms around him. "Forget her," she whispered. "She's dying. And if she survives, we'll finish what nature couldn't." Edward said nothing. But deep down, he knew Vanessa's words were poison. And for the first time, he wondered if he had allied himself with someone even more dangerous than Lila. Back at the hospital, Lila pressed the flash drive into Daniel's hand. Her voice was quiet, but it carried a strength no one expected. "Tell the world the truth. I don't care what happens to me. But my children will grow up knowing their mother fought for them." Daniel nodded, his eyes filled with respect. "You're braver than you think, Lila. Edward won't see you coming." And somewhere in the city, as Edward poured another drink, his phone buzzed again. Another message from the same unknown number. "The world will soon know who you really are." Edward's hand shook. He dropped the glass, shards scattering across the floor. And in that moment, he realized his empire wasn't under attack from outside enemies. It was collapsing from the one woman he had underestimated most. The days after Lila's recovery were a blur of whispers, headlines, and shifting tides. What once seemed impossible, the mighty Edward Langston being questioned, doubted, even mocked, was now happening before the world's eyes. Daniel's articles hit the press like lightning bolts. At first, small leaks, photos of Edward and Vanessa together during Lila's pregnancy, emails where Edward spoke coldly of disposing of problems, contracts forged to cover affairs. But then came the real storm. Vanessa's financial records, showing she had siphoned company funds into her own secret accounts. The empire Edward built began to wobble on its golden pedestal. The public turned. No longer were Edward and Vanessa the glamorous couple gracing magazine covers. They became the city's most despised figures. Justice for Lila trended across social media. Protesters gathered outside Langston headquarters, holding signs that read, "A real man doesn't abandon his family." Inside the hospital, Lila grew stronger each day. She still bore the scars of her near-death battle, but every time she looked at her babies, she felt renewed strength. Clara was always at her side, feeding her soup, watching the triplets with tender care. And Daniel kept her updated on Edward's unraveling empire. One afternoon, as she held her son against her chest, Daniel entered with a calm but urgent expression. "Lila," he said, "Edward is holding a press conference tomorrow. He's going to try to spin this, make himself the victim. But you have the choice to speak too, to tell your story." Lila looked down at her tiny child, his fist curled against her heart. For years, she had been silent, controlled, erased. But now she had a voice, and it could protect not just herself, but her children's future. "I'll speak," she whispered. "Not for me, for them." The next day, the city gathered for Edward's grand attempt at redemption. The press conference was staged in his company's glass tower lobby, a spectacle of polished marble and towering windows. Edward stood at the podium, Vanessa beside him, both dressed in their finest. But the cameras didn't love them the way they once had. Their smiles looked rehearsed, their charm worn thin. "Ladies and gentlemen," Edward began, his voice rich with false sincerity, "there have been rumors, exaggerations, and outright lies spread about me and my family. I want to set the record straight." But he never finished. Because at that exact moment, the doors at the back opened, and a collective gasp swept through the crowd. Lila entered. She wasn't the fragile, broken woman Edward had left behind. She wore a simple but elegant dress, her hair brushed neatly, her posture tall. Clara pushed the stroller carrying the triplets, while Daniel walked beside them protectively. The cameras turned, flashes exploding like fireworks. Edward's face drained of color. Vanessa's smile cracked. Lila walked to the front with quiet dignity, her gaze steady. When she reached the podium, she placed a hand on the stroller, grounding herself in the presence of her children. Her voice was soft, but it carried. "I am Leila Martinez Langston, and I am not invisible." The crowd hushed, leaning closer. "For years I believed in a man who promised me love, protection, and forever. I gave him my loyalty, my youth, my life. When I carried his children, 3 at once, he should have stood beside me. But instead, while I fought for my life in a hospital bed, he stood at an altar with another woman." Gasps filled the room. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras zooming in. Edward's jaw tightened, but he stayed silent, his lawyer tugging at his sleeve to do the same. Lila continued, her eyes glistening but strong. "I nearly died bringing these children into the world. And if I had died, they would have grown up believing their mother was nothing but a shadow. But I'm alive, and I will not let them grow up thinking betrayal is power or cruelty is love." The crowd erupted in applause. Hashtags formed instantly. "Lila speaks," "Triplets of truth." Daniel stepped forward, handing the reporters folders. The proof, the emails, the contracts. These documents show exactly who Edward Langston is. A man who exploited, who lied, who betrayed not just his wife, but his company, his shareholders, and his city. The press went wild. Edward tried to speak, but the microphones were turned toward Lila now, the people's eyes locked on her, not him. Vanessa, realizing the tide had fully turned, snapped at Edward in a harsh whisper. "Do something. Stop her." But Edward was frozen. He had built his empire on fear, but fear no longer worked. The truth was louder. By evening, every news station carried Lila's speech. Across the city, people cried, cheered, and shared her story. Women saw themselves in her pain and her courage. Men questioned their own actions, their own loyalties, and the once invincible Edward Langston was left to drown in the weight of his own arrogance. In the weeks that followed, investigations began. Edward faced charges for fraud, embezzlement,